Hello, today let's talk about World War I, the causes and consequences, and both of them are quite complicated. First of all, let's take a look at the causes. If you go back to 1900, I would think that you'd say that you'd find that most people certainly would not have anticipated a world war. There really was a world war. It went well beyond Europe, countries as remote as China, Mexico, and so on. But anyway, the era around 1900 is often called La Belle Époque, the beautiful era. Well, it soon ceased to be beautiful, and so why? Why does World War I come along when you would think anything but at that time? World trade was improving, economies were improving, life seemed to be getting better, particularly in Europe. Why would that be the place where World War I would erupt? It wasn't that nobody anticipated it, but certainly most people did not. Well, there were a number of reasons for it. Economic competition, certainly. Great Britain had its first great rival in Germany, which was beginning to really thrive, develop its economy through the Second Industrial Revolution, as we've seen before. The German Navy will be deliberately built up. 1898, it will double in size, 1900 double again. And of course the Navy had always been the sort of the crux of the British Empire, Britain ruling the seas and so on and so forth. So Germany begins to be a kind of military rival, becomes an economic rival, although that doesn't mean that World War I is inevitable. You also have nationalist tensions, and they're really going to be one of the major causes of World War I. Because they really flare up in many different areas of Europe, particularly Eastern Europe. And the reason is that you have, first of all, nationalism, which becomes, I think, it's fair to say, the most dominant kind of intellectual development, the most dominant way of understanding who a people are. People defining themselves more and more, or being defined more and more in terms of their language, their culture, their history. And the problem is that you have nations, as they become more and more aware of who they are as a people and their own language, of their own national identity, many of these nations find themselves contained within an empire. And yes, there were 4 empires which dominated Europe, or much of Europe, around 1900. And those are the Russian Empire, the German Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And all of these empires contained minorities, and minorities were becoming more aware of themselves as nations, and nationalism meant that as nations they wanted a state, the nation state. And that had become fairly common parlance, you might say, in Europe, certainly throughout and especially toward the end of the 19th century, with German unification, Italian unification, and so on. Problem, Austro-Hungarian Empire has numerous nations contained within it, including the Magyars or the Hungarians, including the Croatians, including the a number of others, the Czechs, the Slovaks, and so on, many of whom want their own nation or nation state, and many of whom, or a number of whom, will actually attain that. So nationalism becomes one of the chief causes later of World War I. And then, of course, building on all of the things I just mentioned, the alliance system. Britain had held out of all alliances because once you get tangled up in an alliance, you become committed. Once you become committed, you're always at greater risk of entering into a war which you don't want, don't need, and don't anticipate. So Britain had held aloof from that. On the other hand, not everybody had felt like that, and in particular Germany, which after it had unified and had taken a piece of what had been France, Alsace-Lorraine, was in a defensive posture because Germany was always worried about a two-front war. On the one hand, France to the west, and on the other hand, Russia to the east. The Chancellor of Germany, Otto von Bismarck, who became the Chancellor in 1862, was resolved not to ever get in a position where Germany would be at risk for a two-front war. So the main thing was to always keep Russia and France from getting into an alliance which would be aimed, of course, at Germany. So Bismarck will build his alliance system. He starts Austro-Hungary in 1879, a defensive alliance. In 1882, Italy will be added to that, although Italy during World War I will actually change size. But Bismarck goes beyond that. He'll add Russia as a kind of reinsurance policy, as a reinsurance treaty, literally. That remains intact for the entire term in which Bismarck was in power, and that's all the way to 1890. But after 1890, after the disappearance of Kaiser Wilhelm, William I, and the coming to power, the ascending to power of Wilhelm II, the strategy of Bismarck is dropped. And of course, Bismarck himself is dropped and is no longer the chancellor. And the result of this is going to be that the Russian treaty, the insurance or reinsurance policy and treaty, is dropped and abandoned. And that opens the way ultimately for an alliance which will actually form between France and Russia. And there's a lot of reasons for it. It's not just diplomatic, it's not just Germany, there's financial considerations too. But by 1894, essentially France and Russia are in an alliance, and of course it's aimed at Germany. France is still hurting over the loss of the war to Germany in 1871, and Russia, of course, is always nervous about Germany because they have different objectives, particularly in southeastern Europe. So France and Russia actually do form an alliance by 1894. Britain had stayed out, as I said, but there's several reasons why Britain will finally come in and abandon its stance of no understandings or no ententes and no alliances. And one reason is because England almost comes to blows with France over Eastern Africa, over what's going to happen there, over who's going to control, say, Egypt and other parts of Eastern Africa. They always come to war in 1898. And then another thing, in 1899, Britain is involved in a war down in South Africa. And it comes quite close to losing that war. And this spells out the need to look for some sort of alliance, some sort of understanding. Of course, it's going to happen with France. Because France has interest in Western Africa, Morocco, Britain, and Eastern Africa. So they come to an understanding. It's called the Entente Cordiale. It's not a full-blown military alliance, but it's an understanding. That is going to develop, however, and that is because Britain is now involved in an Entente Cordiale with France. France has a full-blown military alliance with Russia. And Russia, of course, wants to expand its connections because it loses the war to Japan in 1905. So it comes together quite nicely in a way that Russian interests, British interests, and French interests all kind of coincide, largely aiming at containing Germany. By 1907, you do have essentially another triple alliance, a triple understanding, call it what you will, but it's a military alliance with Great Britain and France and Russia. So you now have sort of two great alliance systems intact. What's going to happen is that alliance system is essentially going to come into play in 1914. And so when you combine economic reasons, when you combine the diplomatic reasons, alliance systems, economic competition. Perhaps what happened in 1914 was, if not inevitable, something which was more likely than not. It all starts over nationalism, and it all starts in June 28th, 1914, with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who would inherit the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He's assassinated by a man by the name of Princip, a member of Black Hand, which was a kind of radical Serbian organization, very, very upset over the annexation in 1908 of a place called Bosnia. Bosnia was under the control at that time of Austro-Hungarian Empire, and in 1908 it was actually annexed, although it was formerly really part of the Ottoman Empire. And it was annexed in 1908 by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And the result is that the Serbian nationalists, of course, were antagonized by this. So what happened in 1914 was practically inevitable. And the assassination, which occurs in Sarajevo, is the spark, really, that sets off nationalism and sets off the alliance system that actually leads to World War I. And of course, Serbia had hoped, which by the way had only become independent in 1878, having broken away from the Ottoman Empire. Serbian nationalism wants to acquire Bosnia, or as much of Bosnia as it can, because of the large Serbian population. So nationalism becomes a huge factor here, leading to World War I. I won't go through the blow by blow, but the fact that there's an ultimatum made by the Austrians to the Serbians, which the Austrians knew the Serbians would never accept. The Serbs appealed to Russia, which had been their close ally and friend for some time. Russia will back Serbia, begins even to mobilize. And the result is that the alliance system is called into place because Germany threatens Russia, and one blow leads to another. It's sort of like two kids on the block threatening each other, and there you go. And this is the spark that ignites World War I, and which brings the entire alliance system into play. The war does not turn out to be what people had anticipated it to be. It does not turn out to be a war which is won in a month or 2 months, but it goes on for years. As I said, virtually all of Europe was engaged in this war. It is a catastrophic war. It is a world war. The magnitude of the consequences are practically without any kind of parallel or precedent historically. By the time you get to the end, the consequences are phenomenal. Even if you just look at the number of casualties, we're talking about something like 8–10 million people who died, probably at least that number of wounded. Countries like France, Germany are going to lose 1 million or more men just war dead. The United States comes into the war later, still has more than 100,000 casualties. So by the time it's all over, Russia, for example, loses 1.7 million men. By the time it's all over, essentially the male population of Europe has been largely decimated. The physical destruction is enormous. The war costs something like many billions of dollars just because of the destruction. It's going to take years and years and years for just physical plant to be replaced. But it wasn't just physical destruction, and it was certainly even more than the destruction of human lives. It was destruction of economies. It was destruction, you might say, of any notion whatsoever of progress. It was an unbelievable psychological dilemma because people had to abandon the notion that as they mastered technology, as they mastered nature, as they improved living standards, that surely there would be no more wars because actually all those things had happened and yet war had come. And as a matter of fact, new technologies made war even more destructive. So you had all of that as well. You go from a period of relative optimism to a period of relative pessimism. You go from a period, as I said, of destruction, which is going, I think, almost inevitably to lead to depression a decade later after the peace. And then there were many other problems as well. Nationalism wins the day. Woodrow Wilson says, well, what we need is to install democracy everywhere. Every single nation should have its own state. He defines the principle of self-determination, which is all fine and good. The problem is that as the maps of Europe are redrawn and the map of the Middle East is redrawn, there's still many minorities which are contained behind the walls or the borders of the newly established countries. And self-determination, does that mean that they should also have their own states? So the map is redrawn, and in a way which is not necessarily very good for the future. Poland is recreated, which is good, but Germany ends up being divided into two. Poland is in the middle, so that Poland would have access to the sea, but that's going to be a permanent complaint of Germany in the future. There's a significant German population in the newly created state of Czechoslovakia. That's going to cause problems later when Adolf Hitler would say, what about them? They don't have rights in Czechoslovakia. And this is going to be repeated in a number of different areas in Eastern Europe. So you have that. Another consequence, enormous consequence, was the Russian Revolution, which occurs in 1917. It's the second revolution in later October. It's the Leninist-led revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, and that will have, of course, enormous impact on the future of the Russian Empire, now the Soviet Empire, but it will also have enormous impact on virtually every country in the West and around the world, because as communism takes over in Russia, it becomes a new model to compete with democracies in the West. And in many countries, a communist party is established. And while in some countries, the US, Britain, for example, the communist party is never very large, nevertheless, this splits the left. And in Germany, in particular, you now have a communist party, you have a social democratic party, you have a sort of popular people's party. What I mean is you have the fragmentation of the left, and that's going to have an enormous impact, especially in Germany, where the fragmentation of the left makes it very possible for somebody like Adolf Hitler to come to power. The fact that nationalism had become so well established and had helped destroy Europe is going to be a thorn in the future as well. It's going to help people like Adolf Hitler come to power, who can say that Germany was stabbed in the back, and that the German nation deserved a far better deal than it got at Versailles. The Versailles agreements, of course, blame Germany entirely. The reparations that Germany pays, $5 billion by 1921, $25 billion later on. Much of Germany's ability to pay taken away because Germany has to make payments in terms of coal and shipments of different kinds of minerals, etc. And the result is that the German economy remains fairly weak, as well as susceptible because, well, of political divisions that I just mentioned. So you add up all these consequences. What can you conclude? Here's what you conclude: depression almost inevitable. World War II probably very likely. So much for the Versailles Accords. So much for democracy everywhere. And that's it for today.